Hello, my name is Adrian Garcia, and today I'll be showing you how to draw dinosaurs. When I was very young, I was completely obsessed with them, and that's how I got into drawing them. Family and friends told me that I was actually pretty good, so I kept it as a hobby, and now I do it all the time. So today I'm going to be showing you how to draw dinosaurs, some of those techniques. Hopefully you'll learn a thing or two to have some fun. You want to start by just drawing the basic shapes very lightly, just to get a basic idea of where your subject is going to be on your paper. Like a big rounded shape for the body, and the curved shape of the back of the head that this dinosaur is famous for. Just try to get the proportions to feel right to you. This particular dinosaur, called a Triceratops, has two very large horns on its brow and a really large crest that protects its neck at the back of its head. There's also a smaller horn on its nose. It's much smaller than your nose. It has a big haunched back and a thick neck. And its mouth is actually more like a beak, kind of like a parrot. Just make sure that the tip of the beak is kind of pointy, and then draw in the bottom jaw. Go ahead and start drawing in little details, and you can start making those lines a little bolder now that you know what your animal is going to look like. And start drawing in the eye. Now the eye is a very important part, because it could make it or break it. If the eye looks good, then the rest of your drawing will start looking good too. Oh, and by the way, if you're not quite sure about what these details are supposed to look like, there is absolutely nothing wrong with pulling up a picture of one and just looking at it while you draw. I mean, that's the way I learned. So as you can see, now I've sort of begun to draw in where the tail is going to go and where the front arm is going to go. So now we're going to start building on that, and now I'm drawing in the back leg right there. And the back leg should be a little higher up towards the spine than the front leg, and a little bigger. And then there's the tail, not too long. Triceratops did not have a very long tail. So as you can see, I'm just using basic sort of oval shapes to represent the segments of the legs. So right now we're just still, figuring out the shape of it. And right now we're not going to go into too much detail on the legs, but there you go. So you see just basic shapes. There's lines there that'll be erased later. But just, figuring out where they go, where they're going to touch the floor, and just making sure that it has knees and ankles and such. So now that all its limbs are pretty much in order, you can start folding up some of those lines, erasing some of the ones you don't need, and drawing in those toes. Now, I can't quite remember whether it has 4 toes in the front and 5 toes in the back legs, or something like that. But to tell you the truth, from this angle, which is actually just profile, you wouldn't be able to see all of them at the same time anyways. So don't really stress out over how many toes it has. Just make sure it looks nice to you. But I can tell you right now, if you're only drawing 1 toe, well, obviously that's not going to look very great. So, just to be safe, 3 in the front, 3 in the back. Yeah, nobody's going to call you out like, excuse me, your Triceratops didn't have the correct amount of digits on its toes. Nah, that's just not gonna happen, obviously. Oh, and since this is probably not perfectly in profile, you could probably draw in that second horn, just sort of peeking out behind the first one. So now that all the body parts are drawn correctly, you can go ahead and start erasing all those light lines that were just meant there to hold the basic shapes, just to clean it up a little bit. Some depictions of Triceratops have like these small bumps, almost horns, outlining the frill. Some people draw them in and other people don't. I do. Okay, so now we've reached a part in the drawing process where, well, it's basically time to put in some finishing touches. For example, boldening some of those lines and erasing some of the mess I might have made with my hand along the edges, since I have a bad habit of pressing my hand against the paper. So now I feel like I'm ready to start some of the shading. So what I do is I just go in with a pencil and I start darkening the bottom edges and back edges of what I think should be in shadow. And then I intentionally go in with my finger and just start smudging and smearing it all over the dinosaur, just to kind of give it like a fill, like a slight tint. I basically just go do this through everything. Darken out the edges that I think should have a shade or shadow, and then I just smear it. And this will give it kind of like a more feeling of volume. And then you can go in and add even more emphasis to the darkness. Just drawing even darker shapes. And like you can see, use your eraser to highlight where you think it should be brighter. See, the eraser isn't just for clearing up mistakes, it can actually be used during the shading. So now your eraser has 2 uses. So you may notice that there's some lines that I'm either darkening some more or brightening some more. For example, if you notice that there's like sort of like an outline running parallel to the bottom of its stomach, and then there's this other line kind of on top of like where the shoulder should be. Well, these lines are just indications that there's muscle down there, muscle or maybe like a wrinkle. It helps to remember that underneath all this thick skin, there's muscle and bone. For example, underneath the shoulder, there's a shoulder blade, which is why I used highlighting and shading to indicate that there's sort of like a displacement there, a raised bump underneath. Certain areas of this drawing could benefit from some like extra heavy shading. For example, underneath the jaw, underneath the neck, and underneath the stomach. Also, those legs that are behind the animal could benefit from an extra heavy dose of contrast between the light and the shadow, just to give more of an indication that they are in fact in shadow. Now as I continue to shade, you might notice I'm putting in these really little details over where the toes are, and these are just to kind of give it a look of like a cracked, dry, scaly kind of texture over the toes. And it's nothing too big, just kind of small lines, kind of like parallel to each other and running up its toes, kind of like a lizard or a bird, and it's a nice little detail to add. Now shading is also a great way to give an indication of sort of like muscle underneath the skin. Now, as you can see on this back foot here, I'm putting in more emphasis on the darkness where there was these light lines before, and now that they're darker, it sort of gets the idea across that these muscles are bulging out. And that's really the idea behind shading. So before you had an image that looked kind of flat, and maybe it looked nice, but now that you've shaded it, it looks like it's like a three-dimensional object actually standing there with light shining on it. And you know, that takes the picture to a whole new level. It goes from looking nice to looking wow. So at this point I'm really just going back and revisiting some certain areas that I think maybe need more done to it. A little more detail, a little more highlight or shadow. Like that part right there under the eye, it needed a little more. That part right there where the beak is. Just really putting some finishing touches on this thing. As I was drawing this, I accidentally smeared some of the darker parts where I didn't actually mean to. It sort of gave away some of the boldness to where it was, and I'm also going back to those places and putting in some more detail. Like for example, that area under the cheek right there, it used to be darker, so now I went back to it and added that back in, because like I said, I accidentally smeared it because I have the bad habit of pressing my hand against the paper when I draw. So yeah, just go around, adding those little details that you think it needs. Like for example, on the back, the line was kind of broken because of all the erasing I had done, so I went back and revisited that a little bit. Maybe boldening some more lines, like I said. Some of these lines may have become a little blurred during the drawing. I want to go back to those and bolden them up a little bit where it needs them. Maybe a little more detail, some more of that cracked kind of texture that I like to add at the bottom. Some more detail on the tail, which I've kind of neglected up until now. And I'm also going into some of these areas that I think are a little plain and adding some more of that shading to give more of the muscly kind of look. And I'm darkening edges that I think should be shaded a little more. For example, the back edge of this frill right here, it probably should be a little darker. It has a kind of a curved edge, and I hadn't darkened it up enough, so I'm doing that now. It goes a little darker, then smudging it a little bit with my finger so it's not too strikingly bold. And also the shading underneath it, because of course it's going to cast a shadow on the back of its neck. Details like these really add up when you think of it. Later on, when you finish your drawing and somebody looks at it, they're probably not going to nitpick it and go, oh look, what a fine technique you did shading this part underneath the neck and the frill and the stomach and the feet. But they're just going to go, hey wow, that looks good. And to be honest, that pretty much says it all. There was nothing that they looked at and said, oh, that does not look good. And that's basically what you want. Because art is completely in the eye of the beholder. There's no wrong way to do it. It's all just impression. It's all just your interpretation of a certain thing which was in your head, or maybe something that actually exists, or in this case used to exist. So there's no wrong way to do it. If it looks good to you, that's really all that matters. It's art. This is just something that I like to do in my spare time, and I've always liked to do it in my spare time ever since I was really little. And of course, when I was a little kid, I drew like a little kid. It was stick people and smiley faces, and whenever I drew an animal, it had a smiley face on it, even though, you know, animals don't have smiley faces. But even that could be considered art. It totally could. That was a small child's interpretation of what a dinosaur looks like in his head, put it down on paper as best as he possibly could, and yeah, probably looked better in his head than it ended up on paper, but there you go, it's art. And you know what? This is really no different. This is how I see it in my head, and this is how I put it down. So it's probably gonna improve. You know what? It probably still looks better in my head. But there you go. A little window into what I think when I'm drawing dinosaurs. Thanks for watching.